Hello, everyone. My name is Dana Ortegón, and I'm a Senior Content Strategist at MadPow. I'm going to be talking to you today about using storytelling to educate, persuade, and engage. But before we get started, I just want to take care of a bit of housekeeping. I'm planning on speaking for about 45 minutes, and then I will take questions. So on your screen, you see a slide with the GoToWebinar interface on it, and that shows you where to put your questions today. My colleague Ryan is going to handle any technical issues that might come up, so you can put questions about that in there. And if you have questions about my topic, you can also put them in and we will attack them at the end. So let's get started. If content strategists had a mission statement, it would be that we get the right information to the right people at the right time, in the right format, for the right reasons. And as a content strategist at MadPow, that looks like a lot of things. It's educating people about their liability risk for an insurance provider, because you need a pretty special kind of messaging to overcome most people's optimism bias, that voice in our head that says bad things are never going to happen, not to me, right? We want people to be aware of their risk, but we don't want to use fear tactics. Content strategy at MadPow also looks at persuading people that having a health risk assessment benefits them. What we've seen in our research is a lot of people think that assessments like these are Big Brother trying to come into their life in the form of insurance companies, that they're going to use the information to raise their premiums or penalize them in some way. But understanding potential health risks and current health challenges is key to helping people live healthier lives, no matter what their current situation is. And content strategy is also about engaging people in their health management, writing daily tips to encourage them if they have chronic conditions, helping them stick to their treatment plans, and empowering them to take the small steps that they can take to improve their health. Doing all of that takes more than just fun, witty copy. We have to understand what's getting in the way of healthy behaviors, address their personal barriers, and speak to them in a way that makes them believe that they can make a difference in their health. In light of the COVID-19 pandemic, things like informing, educating, and persuading people, understanding barriers and figuring out how to get around them, and identifying the right messaging and the right timing for those messages are even more critical. And storytelling is a great tool for that. So how did I get interested in storytelling as a content strategy tool? You may or may not know this, but the field of content strategy attracts a large number of people who have unfinished novels in their desk drawers. We are, most of us, quite interested in words and communication. We are a lot of writers. Like many content strategists, I came from a copywriting background. And when I came to MadPow, a lot of my work had a strong healthcare focus. As a people-centered agency, a good part of my work every day revolves around understanding where people are coming from and their lived experiences. So while doing research for a project, I discovered Columbia University's program for narrative medicine. And this program uses writing as a way for patients to share their experiences with their medical providers. And it's a great tool for building empathy. So if you can imagine a typical provider visit, it's often a series of interview questions. What brings you here today? Are you having any pain? What do you eat every day? How is your sleeping? What's your mood been like? Do you take your medicine as directed? And what we find is that people answer those questions the way they think their provider wants them to. They don't want to disappoint anybody. They don't want to be scolded. They don't want to be judged or punished. Imagine what might happen if you asked something like this. Pick a day from the last week and walk me through it so I can understand your life a little better. Now, you might hear something like this. Well, last Friday I was hoping to play golf with my brothers, but when I woke up, I felt really short of breath. At first, I thought maybe it was just the ragweed because the pollen count's been high, but it didn't go away when I took my allergy medicine. So we skipped the golf game and just got lunch. That's been happening more and more where I just don't have the energy to do anything. I can't even walk the dog anymore. I know I've put on a few pounds this summer, and that probably doesn't help my health. Is this how it's going to be from now on? Sometimes I can barely fall asleep. I just lie there worrying about the future and how long a future I actually have. That's narrative medicine, getting people to tell you their stories. And one of the core principles of narrative medicine is that receiving patients' stories helps to build empathy in physicians, and that, in turn, improves the quality of care. One study in 2011 looked at the effects of physician empathy on people with diabetes. And what researchers found is that patients who had doctors with high empathy scores were significantly more likely to have good control of their blood sugar levels compared to patients of physicians with low empathy scores. Another study from 2012 showed that people with migraines had better health outcomes and were more likely to stick with their management plans if they felt that their doctors were empathetic to their condition. And narratives and writing are also important tools for healthcare providers to process their experiences. JAMA, the Journal of the American Medical Association, even has a poetry editor, Rafael Campo, whose poem about caring for patients at the start of the COVID crisis is up on the screen right now. Every month, he selects and publishes poems written by doctors, nurses, EMTs, and caregivers, and these poems get thousands of views. But as much as I loved the idea of narrative medicine, I wasn't about to drop everything and move back to New York to get a master's, and the timing of the certificate program was never really right. And then one day last fall, I saw a class on healthcare narratives at the Writers Studio, and the instructor was a graduate of the Columbia program. The class turned out to be a creative writing class, not a way to learn more about narrative medicine. And I realized that I was going to be spending the next 6 weeks trying to become the next David Foster Wallace. Rather than call it a total wash, I started looking for ways to apply my learnings about creative writing or storytelling to my work as a content strategist. Which brings us to our topic for the day. So shortly after the start of the pandemic, my colleagues at MadPow started sharing their thoughts and expertise about how we might respond as individual practitioners and as an agency. Their work includes podcasts, articles, and webinars covering a huge range of topics like designing home screening products, how to support students during COVID, how to develop your career during a recession, service design during a pandemic, and designing digital customer experiences that work in this pandemic age. Today's webinar is a follow-up to the one our VP of Experience Strategy, Jen Brazelli, gave a couple of weeks ago. She spoke about the dismaying trend of science denial and strategies for designing science communication to combat that denial. As part of the series, they asked our content strategy team if we wanted to speak to the issue of designing science and health communications from a content strategy perspective. And of course, we leapt at the chance. And to prepare, I tuned into Jen's webinar and ended up with 4 key takeaways. This isn't anything new. It's not just lack of education. Good communication starts with empathy, and storytelling is key to designing science communication. Let's look at those learnings more closely. First, while it's easy to imagine that the 2020 year is uniquely horrible in terms of our deep divisions between people and groups, Jen pointed out that this isn't anything new. The more things change, the more they stay the same. That was then, and this is now. 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 So yeah, the news cycle is full of some pretty crazy stuff, but that brings us to takeaway number 2. It's not just lack of education. Facts aren't enough to sway opinion. You can't just assume that people would change their minds if you just gave them more facts. In fact, presenting more facts often makes the situation worse, causing people to double down on their opinions and beliefs, even if they're based on misinformation. And that's because of a powerful phenomenon known as confirmation bias. One researcher presented statements about climate change to people who believed it was real and those who thought it was a hoax. And she found that for both groups, when the statements that she presented confirmed what they already thought, this strengthened their beliefs. But when it challenged their views, they ignored it. That's confirmation bias. Things, statements, facts, data, opinions, testimonials, if they strengthen what we already believe in, we think of them as being more credible, more real. Humans have a documented tendency to take in data that confirms our beliefs and ignore the rest. So no, most people aren't being willfully ignorant. And if we proceed with the belief that they're stupid or stubborn, our efforts are probably going to fail. And that's why takeaway number 3 matters so much. Good communication starts with empathy. There's that word again. We can't get anywhere without empathy. In this case, it's understanding how a person's worldview affects how they perceive and process information. Jen introduced this matrix that came out of the Yale Cultural Cognition Project. It helps you predict how people who hold certain worldviews are likely to react to messaging and communications by understanding what they value and what threatens those values. So if your worldview is more hierarchical, then stability, authority, and expertise affirm it, while harsh criticism of traditional roles and industry threaten it. If your worldview is more egalitarian, equality, access, and participation affirm it, while denial of participation, access, and status threaten it. If your worldview is more individualist, then resourcefulness, independence, and privacy affirm it, while interference and constraints on personal freedoms threaten it. And finally, if your worldview is more communitarian, you value collaboration, community, and stewardship, while you feel threatened by unrestricted competition and threats to social supports. So can we predict which people probably won't be okay with compulsory health measures like wearing masks? Yes. The person that falls in this quadrant, who's more of an individualist and more egalitarian, they don't want the government telling them what to do, even if it's supposedly for the good of society as a whole. So how do we take on confirmation bias and conflicting worldviews? Well, that's the 4th takeaway. Storytelling is key to designing science communication. This diagram maps out a design strategy for science communication. Jen touched on the element of storytelling, using relevant metaphors and telling a meaningful story, but it seemed like this could be a great launching point for a content strategy focused look at design communication. But first, I want to take a few steps back to talk about some general best practices for health communication, or really any communication. And these focus on plain language. A common misconception about plain language is that it means dumbing down your content, but that's simply not the case. If you are familiar with plainlanguage.gov, they are a premier resource for information and tools and techniques for plain language. And this is that site's definition. And really what plain language means is that people can find what they need, they understand what they find, and they can use it to meet their needs. When we're sharing valuable information about science and health, we want our audience to understand what we're saying. That's the baseline before we ever get to talking about influencing their opinions or behaviors. And we need to understand what's competing for people's attention as they consume our content. This is particularly true when we think of health-related content. Remember the start of the pandemic, when things seemed to be changing daily. There was so much conflicting information, and we were all struggling to figure out what to believe, who to believe, and how much we were at risk. So I'd like to review my top 10 best practices for plain language to give you an idea of the small changes you can make to get your science and health communications off to a good start. First, use active voice. Writing in the active voice means that the subject of your sentence performs the action. So here in this example, rather than saying your health assessment form was received, you would say, we received your health assessment form. It puts responsibility and action into an actual entity. It's more personal. And the thing about active sentences is that they are more actionable and direct. They're generally easier to understand, and they often require fewer words, which is great when you're trying to create a streamlined reading experience for your users. So number 2, write like you speak. Formal language creates a distance between you and your readers. So when you use contractions and personal pronouns, it's a way to have a more conversational person-to-person tone. You can see that in this example. Acme Widgets is here when our customers need us is, a little more removed than saying to someone, we're here when you need us, which implies warmth and personal connection. Now, if you're writing for a number of different audiences in the same communication piece, we advise you to preface. So we might say, if we were talking about flu shots, if we're speaking to parents and providers, we would want to note when we were doing that. So something like, if you're the parent of small children, talk to their pediatrician about flu shots, because you always want to make it clear who you're speaking to. The CDC does a great job with plain language and clear communication. And I just wanted to show you this example. They have a very conversational tone. They use personal pronouns, how to protect yourself, what to do if you are sick. But I think that there are some opportunities for improvement. Rather than using these labels, self-check symptoms and people at increased risk, here's another place where they could add a little bit more of that personal language. Check your symptoms. Am I at risk? Those are just 2 things that they could do to fix that. So our third best practice for plain language is to avoid jargon and technical terms. And I think this is something that most of us know, but it's easy to get swept away. I know when COVID started, I wasn't a person who ever spoke about PPE, but all of a sudden it just became part of my regular vocabulary. And so as content creators, it's good to take a step back and put yourself in the shoes of lay people. So here are some examples that came from an amazing plain language cheat sheet for COVID that AHA Media created, and just gives you some examples. Rather than say transmission, we can say passing the virus from one person to another. Novel strain becomes a new kind of virus. And instead of pathogen, why not just say germ? Number 4 is to avoid acronyms or spell them out the first time they're used. So here we have a common thing that you probably have seen, PCP, primary care provider. If we are saying primary care provider, we would say to use the acronym in parentheses in the first instance, and then if you are continuing to use it in a document, you can then continue to use the acronym. Or even better, why not say doctor instead of primary provider? It's much simpler. We also like to eliminate fluff, right? Every word we use should do a specific job. A lot of times these are the adverbs that we put in to make our copy have a little more personality, but when someone is reading quickly through a document, they really just want to get to the point. So if you need to find a doctor, it is really easy. It could be summed up pretty quickly as it's easy to find a doctor. Now, our 6th one is write to the right reading level. If you look to the left, you'll see that the help copy that I pulled off of a website, that's written at a college reading level. And it only took a few tweaks to get the same information across at a much lower reading level on the right side. That's at a 5th grade reading level. Obviously, you want to tailor the reading level to your audience. If you're writing for medical professionals, you can use complex terminology and sentence structure. But if you're writing for the general public, we say go no higher than an 8th grade reading level, and to be really safe, maybe stick to 6th grade, especially if you're talking about health issues or health information. There are a lot of great tools to help you score your text. We use the Hemingway app and readable.com. This is an example of a report that you might get if you scored some text on readable.com, and you can see that it actually tells you a lot of great information. It points out grammar and spelling errors. It tells you how many instances there are of passive voice, cliches, and adverbs. It tells you how many long sentences and really long sentences you have, and it can even tell you if your language is too formal or whether your copy uses enough keywords to meet SEO best practices. So number 7 and number 8 I grouped together because they are related. It's all about helping your readers take in content easily. The first is to create a visual hierarchy, an obvious path for the eye to follow. So we know that most readers scan. When you use informative headers and subheads, that gives them an outline of the page contents and clues to what they'll find if they read more. Another bonus about using headers and subheads is it improves search engine optimization, and because it makes it easier for users to find the information that they need. We also say to emphasize important content visually. So in this example, you can see that we've used boxes around some of the content. We've used bold copy as lead-ins to the steps, and we've used both the box and an background or fill-in color when we get to the CTA at the bottom. This is just a wireframe, but it shows you how that visual hierarchy can come across even when you're just using text. So number 9 is all about breaking up dense content, and there are a couple of strategies to help you do that. Again, you have limited time to catch your reader and draw them into your content. It's difficult for them to scan dense blocks of copy, and when they do encounter them, people often just opt out. They leave, right? Especially if they're in a hurry, feeling stressed, or maybe aren't the strongest reader. So here you can see one strategy is to use bullets. This is an example about applying for Medicaid or understanding Medicaid eligibility. And on the left, we have a very dense paragraph. On the right, we've taken the exact same information, we've streamlined it a little bit, we've added bullets. So someone who's reading the after copy can easily scan and see what are the different factors that impact eligibility. We also advocate for splitting copy into smaller chunks and creating standalone sections that have one main theme or idea. And we also say to group lists of more than 5 items into bullets. Putting steps into numbered lists is also a great way to break up dense content. This example is from the CDC. It's instructions for washing your hands the right way. You can see that they're making it easy to understand right from the header, informing the reader right away that there are 5 steps, which then is reinforced down below with the numbers. Lists are incredibly helpful because they highlight levels of importance. They help the reader understand the order in which things are happening or should happen. They help readers skim and scan. They make it easy to identify every step in a process. And they also add some white space to make it a little bit easier to read. And for our last best practice, this is another way to simplify complex content, and that's to use tables. And this is an example from a health insurer's website. And these are the tier descriptions for their gold, silver, and bronze plans. Most of us have had some experience with trying to read and decode this type of information. This is super dense, lots of information. Now, when we take that same information and put it into a table, it's far easier just to scan through and compare apples to apples. You can see copay across the 3 tiers, deductible across the 3 tiers, and also features across all 3 options. So while we encourage you to use those 10 best practices to craft your work, readable, understandable writing isn't just a matter of following the rules. Online readability tools are useful for flagging issues like those long sentences, passive voice, long words, too many adverbs, but there's an art to using this information. For example, splitting one long sentence into 2 to meet a minimum word count doesn't ensure readability. If something sounds awkward or choppy, your readers will notice. That's why many experts on plain language and health literacy recommend that you read your work out loud to ensure that it sounds natural and conversational, the way it would sound if you were talking directly to someone else. And we also recommend using short, simple words with fewer than 2 syllables, but that doesn't mean you can't use words like hospital or information. People use a lot of words with more than 2 syllables every day. So the rule, they're just here to remind us to look for the simplest way to say things whenever we can. And now we're going to get back to storytelling. You have a good grounding in how to communicate clearly and simply. Communicating with the purpose of educating and persuading your audience isn't anything new. We can look to Aristotle's 3 rhetorical appeals for guidance. He based these appeals on 3 concepts. Ethos is the Greek word for ethics. This concept is all about credibility, how much people trust you and believe what you have to say. Logos is Greek for logic. Logic is about facts, evidence, and proof that what you say is true. Pathos is the Greek word for emotion, and this facet is all about how people experience your message, how it makes them feel. In a perfect world, you could establish yourself as a credible expert and lay the facts out simply and clearly, and convert your audience to your worldview, and then convince them to do the things you want them to do. But thanks to confirmation bias and our differing worldviews, it's not so simple. Because as you've seen, our worldview affects who and what we believe. A year ago, we would have thought that the CDC, the World Health Organization, and Anthony Fauci were the ultimate incredible sources. But after 6 months of mixed messages, we're left wondering. If we can't rely on ethos and logos, that leaves us with pathos. If we want to design effective science communications, we're going to have to speak to people in emotionally resonant ways. We need to become better storytellers. Fortunately, storytelling is part of our DNA. Cave paintings that show the human capacity for visual storytelling date back farther than 40,000 years. Some researchers believe that images like this one found in an Indonesian cave show the dawn of spirituality. We tell stories every day. For me, sometimes that's literally, like when I'm storyboarding, but it also includes deliverables like pitch decks, insights reports, client presentations, and wireframes. But we're also storytelling anytime we give advice, share a memory, tell someone how a client meeting went, or catch up with friends over Zoom. So I'd like to talk about 3 aspects of storytelling that make it such a great strategy for educating, engaging, and persuading people. The first, stories foster social cooperation and teach social norms. The second, we learn better when we learn through stories. And the third, storytelling builds empathy. When you think of fostering social cooperation and teaching social norms, think of Aesop's fables, which always ended with a moral. In the story of the tortoise and the hare, like you see here, we learned that slow and steady wins the race, or maybe never give up. In the story of the grasshopper and the ants, we learned that hard work pays off. In the story of the fox and the grapes, we learned that it's easy to hate what you can't have. And that's the origin of the phrase sour grapes. And there were myriad other stories that had morals. The boy who cried wolf. If you lie all the time, nobody will trust you. The story of King Midas. Greed is bad. The second critical aspect of storytelling for communicators to understand is that we learn better when we learn through stories. Introducing new knowledge through a narrative that an audience can relate to provides a context for them to absorb and understand and analyze complex information more easily. The human brain can absorb and retain scientific knowledge and messages much better when it's introduced through a coherent narrative. Case in point, Schoolhouse Rock. I can still recite the preamble to the Constitution thanks to hearing it in between many a Saturday morning cartoon. I won't make you listen to me sing it, but I could. And finally, as you heard earlier, storytelling builds empathy. This is oxytocin, a neurochemical that's responsible for empathy and narrative transportation. When we're really into a story, when we get immersed in it, our bodies release oxytocin. We start to emotionally resonate with the story's characters. We feel what they feel. It's like we're in the story with them. That's what we mean when we say that a story transported us. I'd like to spend some time talking about pop culture as a particularly relevant type of storytelling. It's something that I've been interested in since participating in a rapid design challenge focused on early detection of Alzheimer's disease. My team was assigned to develop a strategy for getting people to opt into cognitive testing earlier. And one of our most out-of-the-box solutions was to petition Netflix to add a storyline around cognitive testing into one of its original shows. We ended up not presenting this idea to the larger group, but it got me thinking about the role TV could play in changing people's perceptions, attitudes, and beliefs, especially in regard to their health. In 2017, Netflix premiered a reboot of the 70s sitcom One Day at a Time. Both versions of this show feature a single mom raising two kids on her own. In the reboot, Penelope is a Cuban-American nurse and a veteran of the war in Afghanistan. She's single because her ex-husband, also a vet, has struggled to get help for his PTSD. So in one episode, Penelope wrestles with the decision to take antidepressants that her doctor has prescribed. And she tells her boss, as a nurse, I would totally recommend them. As a Cuban, I would suffer in silence. Being a content strategist who frequently works on projects related to healthcare and behavior change, that scene in the doctor's office made all my antennae go up. Penelope's lines may have been followed by a laugh track, but they speak to a serious truth. In general, Hispanics are less likely to seek treatment for mental health problems. The ones that do are reluctant to use antidepressants, and half of them never return to a therapist after the first session. One study showed that just 5% of Hispanics surveyed took antidepressants, even though 27% suffered from depression. But statistics rarely build empathy. What does? Observing the depths of Penelope's depression, the stigma her culture puts on mental illness, and the courage it takes for her to seek help anyway. Presenting that storyline, that outcome, that character's actions, that's a way to help people change. Sitcoms have a history of presenting tough topics to Americans. In the 70s, we tuned into All in the Family, Maude, The Jeffersons, and Good Times. Shows that tackled topics like rape, abortion, and racism, all created by Norman Lear. Today, the USC Annenberg Norman Lear Center offers a program called Hollywood Health and Society that provides the entertainment industry with accurate and up-to-date information for storylines on health, safety, and security. Since 2001, the Hollywood Health and Society program has collaborated with the CDC to analyze national data on TV viewing habits and the impact of health storylines on audiences. Its health styles survey has shown that over half of regular viewers report learning something about a disease or how to prevent it from a daytime or primetime drama. Regular viewers also report taking action after hearing something about a health issue or disease on a soap opera. And half of regular viewers reported that they took action about a health issue or a disease after seeing something about it on a primetime show. The Health Style Survey also sponsors an annual awards called the Sentinel Awards, which honor shows that inform, educate, and motivate viewers to make choices for healthier and safer lives. In 2019, the winners dealt with topics like addiction, criminal justice, mental health, nuclear risk, climate change, aging, and sexual assault. I'm so curious to see how shows will incorporate COVID-related storylines going forward and how they might be recognized by the Sentinel Awards. But pop culture doesn't just help people live healthier lives. It can also influence our beliefs and attitudes. In the February 2016 issue of Pop Justice, the authors posit that popular culture can be a highly effective agent of change. Hollywood isn't reality. We all know that. But that unrealness may be one of the reasons that messages get through to people. Now that I've covered the effectiveness of storytelling to educate, engage, and persuade, I'd like to share 2 templates that you can use to craft your own narratives. I first heard about them through the work of Randy Olson, a marine biology professor turned filmmaker who's been evangelizing for the use of narrative as a means to share research findings and other science communication more effectively and a little less boringly. Our first template asks you to summarize the theme of your story in a single word or short phrase. This is a Dobzhansky template named for the geneticist who once said, "Nothing about biology makes sense except in the light of evolution." So that's our template. Nothing in blank makes sense except in the light of blank. If we look back at the cultural cognition framework we talked about, how might we use this template to communicate effectively to the widest range of worldviews about COVID in general and activities like mask wearing specifically? Well, as always, we can start with empathy. When you turn on the radio or TV or scroll through Twitter, what do you see and hear from people? I'm going to lose my job. My mom might die. They're going to force me to get a vaccine. There's not enough toilet paper. My kids will fall behind in school. My business is going to go under. I can't pay my rent. The government wants to control us. I can't pay my mortgage. It will never be normal again. People are afraid of a lot of things, and maybe that's one place to start your messaging. Nothing in this pandemic makes sense except in the light of fear. When you can distill your narrative down to one word or theme, it gives you clarity. It's really an aha moment. In this case, once you identify your theme as fear and start thinking about how fear affects the way people relate to the pandemic, it's kind of mind-blowing. I am afraid. Those are 3 very simple words, but just for a moment, allow yourself to fill in the blanks that come after that with something that you're afraid of. You might actually feel, even for just a second, a flicker of unease or sick to your stomach or dread. And if you can take that thing you're feeling and imagine someone else feeling it too, that creates empathy. It connects you. And now imagine that you want that person to feel better. You don't want them to be afraid anymore. What can you say to them? What do they need to hear? This is how you begin to craft your messaging strategy. Whether you explicitly acknowledge the fears or not, you have to find ways to mitigate them. When we affinity map the types of fears we hear, we can see one distinct pair of concerns that might belong to that fictional individualist egalitarian we looked at earlier. That's over on the right. We see a bunch of fears that fall into the category of general economic and human concerns over on the left. And there in the middle is a fear that almost all of us who are living through this crazy time might share. There's no such thing as normal anymore. I don't think it's impossible to create messaging that acknowledges these fears, especially if you can find those overlapping areas of unity. Our next template, and, but, therefore, or ABT, asks you to summarize your story in a single sentence. Blank and blank, but blank, therefore blank. ABT is a classic storytelling structure that uses three forces to build dramatic tension and then pay it off. You have the agreement or the setup. You have the contradiction or the problem. That's when things get hairy. And you have the consequence or the resolution. It's a happy ending, it's a sad ending, it's a pick your own ending. ABT is a classic storytelling structure that uses these three forces that I'm about to talk about to build dramatic tension and then pay it off. The structure is simple, clear, and powerful. And once you've heard about it, you'll start seeing it all over. Let's go back to our old friends, the tortoise and the hare. The tortoise and the hare were racing. And the hare was way faster. But the tortoise was smarter. Therefore, they won the race. When we apply ABT to science or health communication, it may look like this. And that's the background context. It's what we know. But is the knowledge gap, what's critical, what people need to understand. And therefore, the implications, the consequences, what needs to change. Let's look at a health communication example. Masks can help stop the spread of COVID-19. They protect the people who wear them and the people around them. But if your mask doesn't fit you properly, you're still at risk. Therefore, if you're going to wear a mask, you have to make sure it fits correctly. Health communication is like any other storytelling. To capture people's attention, you have to find the tension. We may say we don't like drama, but in truth, we are so there for it. The tension in this narrative is that wearing an improperly fitting mask doesn't protect you. That's the problem I want to solve, the information I want to communicate. Because the more people out there wearing properly fitting masks, the safer we'll all be. The tension in this structure answers the key question, why should I care? And that's how you hook your audience's attention. Let's look at another example. Sleep is an important aspect of health, and most adults need 7 to 9 hours of sleep. But most of us don't get anywhere close to that on a regular basis. As a result, many people are driving while drowsy, which is just as dangerous as driving drunk. One of the challenges of doing ABT right is that we have to be concise and compelling. Concise means telling your story with as few extraneous words as possible. Again, that's a best practice, cut the fluff. Compelling means being specific enough that it's meaningful and relevant to your audience. Otherwise, it won't be engaging or persuasive. Let's use what we've learned to do an ABT makeover. This is a hand washing poster for folks who work in healthcare facilities. It starts out strong with the statement, potentially deadly germs might be on anything you touch in the healthcare facility. That's followed by, these germs might stay on your hands until you clean them. And it ends with a strong call to action, clean your hands often so you don't bring germs home. How could we improve this poster to build more tension and deliver a stronger, more compelling story? Well, what if we edited it to say, potentially deadly germs might be on anything you touch in the healthcare facility. And since germs are invisible, you don't know if you've touched them or not. But these germs will stay in your hands until you clean them. Therefore, clean your hands often so you don't bring germs home. I've covered a lot today, from best practices for plain language to simple storytelling templates that you can apply to a broad range of communications. And if you're wondering how those techniques work in the real world, I'll leave you with this. When it comes to educating, engaging, and persuading people about health and science, you'll never get through to them if you rely solely on facts and logic. You need to tell a compelling story. But even though we've read and heard stories for our whole lives, most of us aren't intuitive storytellers. Therefore, if you want to be a more effective storyteller and communicator, you should try using the strategies and templates you learned today. And that's it. I am ready to take questions. Now you can see me too. I see a comment from Marion that other healthcare providers, especially nurses, are also doing a lot with storytelling and narrative medicine. And that's true. There is an entire, like a Twitter follow thing that I have seen that brings in nurses and other caregivers. And I will take note and add that. They're doing a lot of important work around that. I'm glad it's nice to see my face. So here's a question. How do you balance storytelling principles when you are limited by character count in SMS messaging? I would say that if you can try to get your hook into the SMS message itself, that, and then bring your reader into another piece of content, like if it's an app, bring them into the app, or a landing page, that's probably the best way to do that. So you would have to really think about who the audience is, understand their concerns, understand what they're trying to do, any barriers that they might face, and then try to get the hook right into that text. So for instance, with the mask example that I had, you know, it might be something around what you don't know about mask fitting could affect you. That's what I would say. Any specific tips for persuading people in power? Wow, I wish I knew. I don't know that people in power are that much different in the way that they, you know, in their cognitive processes. I think they're a lot like the rest of us, right? So they have their own confirmation biases, they have their own fears. So I would almost say that if we can stop thinking of them that way, it might be easier to communicate with them. If I would imagine that the scientists and physicians who have access to people in power could use maybe some of the strategies or some of the worldview framework so that to address those people in power in ways that might actually overcome the confirmation bias, overcome their the walls that their worldview puts up. Do you ever use these techniques internally to convince your colleagues? If so, how have you utilized them at work? We use these techniques quite a bit with clients. I don't think that we use them in such a, like when I'm trying to persuade someone on my team to do something a certain way, I don't think that I have to be as formal about it. I think that there is an intuitive flow, especially to the and, but, therefore, when you're having a conversation with your team and you're discussing different ways, for instance, that you're going to lay out content on a screen, I think the flow is natural, right? It's like, well, if we put the CTA here, you know, the main CTA at the bottom of the screen, the person's going to stop reading mid-screen, and then they won't see the CTA that we want them to have. Therefore, they're never going to take the action that we want them to take. It's a natural flow. I don't think it's something that we formally think through. How can design help storytelling in a COVID world where you need to minimize contact but maximize storytelling? I'm curious. I would like to know more about that. In a way, I think that the COVID world has created more space for storytelling. For instance, we're all on Zoom, we're all on camera all the time. And I think that creates an informality, even with, for instance, talking to a healthcare provider. I think people might feel less as if they're taking up their provider's time or their questions are stupid. There's just a more relaxed environment or atmosphere when you're talking over video. So I'm very curious about the context in that. I feel like, especially with COVID, people are constantly reaching out for more information. So we have had more opportunity to create things for them that we can infuse with storytelling and compassion. What are ways to advocate for this type of storytelling at a company that does not see the value in it? Well, I was gonna say, oh, get all the statistics and that'll convince them. But yeah, I think that statistics do help a little bit when you're dealing with organizations that don't see value. Maybe not statistics, but metrics. So if you can show that storytelling builds empathy, or storytelling, you got a bunch of really important information across, and now your call center volume has dropped by 15%, or you can show that other organizations have done that. So if you can point to success metrics that show the effectiveness of storytelling, I think people are open to that. But they do like to see, like, well, what's in it for me? What is it really going to do? Does it really work, or is it just a feel-good tactic? How does this translate to verbal communication? Asking a patient to complete a medication review on the phone. I would say that when you are speaking with someone on the phone, starting the conversation with a small bit of storytelling or that narrative medicine might be helpful. So before you go into the questions that might be on your checklist, ask them that open-ended thing, like, how have you been feeling, or have you had any issues lately? But just any type of question that is going to build some rapport and make it seem that you're interested in them as a person and not just something to be checked off on a list. It seems hard to apply this in 140 characters. Possibly, but if we go back to the Dobzhansky template, which is all about distilling your theme or your message into a word, I mean, once you've gotten that type of clarity around it, I don't know. I mean, I use the example of fear. I think that you could talk about fear in 140 characters. I don't think storytelling is the answer to every problem. And there's a lot of stuff we can't do in 140 characters, right? I probably can't convince someone to take a health risk assessment in a single tweet, but I can start the conversation. And I think that that's another interesting part about storytelling is, you know, you can plant the seed that then you follow up with. How best to communicate to harried caregivers. I mean, it depends on what you're trying to communicate. If you're trying to communicate actual caregiving medical information, would be very different than communicating a message of empathy and support. I would say, you know, how best to communicate to harried caregivers, you might start by speaking to the caregivers, doing some research, finding out, you know, how do they want to be communicated with? What do they want to learn? What do they feel they're not learning? What information is missing? What's hard for them to find? Start there, and once you have that information, then I think you can start telling the story. What if people who do have different values from you do not see the facts in the ABT as correct? Yeah, that's a hard one. The templates give you the structure, but I do think that you have to, it's not a magic wand. Just because I used and button therefore does not mean I'm going to convince anyone. So I think what you have to do is take that person's worldview and really figure out what the but is for that worldview. Define it. And that might not be a statistic or a fact. It might be just a statement that reassures their fears or answers a question that they have. Again, yeah, it's not a magic wand. I think you have to go back to their worldview, understand it, and then craft your but and your therefore around that. We are at 1 o'clock, so I'm sorry, there are a lot of questions, but we'll be sending out our PDF slides, and it seems like there's a lot of interest in storytelling, which is great. So we have some follow-up activities cooked up. So hopefully I will see all of you soon in the future. Thanks, everyone.